Joining us is Adele, and she's going to be speaking to us on agility and discipline. Adele's been getting better and better at creative production from individuals, from teams, and from organizations from her career obsession. In her most recent role, she improved product development and engineering execution across a 100-person team, 10-team organization, and getting them working like a well-oiled machine. So she's a master of her craft, and I'm excited to bring her up on stage. Welcome, Adele.
Thank you. Oh, you're hard to see. Hi, everyone. So my name's Adele, and my talk today is about some of the unique challenges of rolling out Agile practices in startup environments, and then the relationship between agility and discipline. So my own unorthodox career path could really be the topic of another talk. So I'm just going to jump in and begin this story in really the fall of 2011, which is when I was tasked with what was at the time called improving execution at a growing startup called Tagged. Now, Tagged's main product is a social network for meeting new people with about 5 billion page views and 15 million active users per month, just to give you kind of a sense of scale. We had been profitable since 2008, but we were really kind of struggling to take it to the next level. In the first half of that year, in the first half of 2011, we had tripled in team size. We went from about 50 people to then nearing 200. But we were not seeing similar growth trajectories in other important areas. So really kind of, I'm really a bookworm at heart. So the first thing I did when tasked with this is to go on kind of a reading binge. So I just binged on Agile transformation literature to try and figure out what to do to help my team. And while that reading was incredibly valuable, it was also kind of frustrating because most of the advice didn't really seem to apply to my situation. While it did impress upon me that, that a critical piece of any transformation was going to be the work of influencing my teammates, the material I came across spoke to those challenges of influencing, assuming that my context was one of a bigger, slower, more formal organization that was moving to waterfall from established process, from typically waterfall process. And I was really coming from what I would say would be the other side of the spectrum. We didn't really have a slow bureaucracy. We had really what I would call like a Wild West context. We didn't really have much process or structure at all. And this is really one of the key things that makes an Agile transformation at startups different. When my journey into this began, I had some people kind of dismissively tell me that since my context was a green field or a clean slate, that it was going to be kind of easy peasy or simple. And I had not really found that to be true. So in a lot of ways, that's what's kind of motivating this talk, is that I'm here today to share with all of you what I've learned from my experiences in this so far. So let's talk a little bit more about startup cultures. I'd like to take a quick poll of the room. So raise your hand if you'll admit to having a bit of a rebellious streak. How about like a skeptical nature? So do you guys work in tech? Now at a startup, almost everybody in the room will raise their hands. And that makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because startups are born of an impulse to disrupt, to rebel against the status quo, to break rules. They hustle, they're scrappy, they're lean by necessity, and they improvise and iterate because that's how they innovate and survive. And I love all that. I love working in a startup context. And while that kind of culture is in many ways really fertile ground for Agile, that very nature is also the source of some of the challenges that I'm going to talk about. So first, you'll encounter the belief that we're already Agile. And there can actually be some truth to that, which makes it difficult to navigate through. For example, if part of the promise or sales pitch of Agile is that it will help you move faster and respond better to change by being more lightweight, transparent, human-centered, and by giving individual contributors more autonomy and empowerment, startups often already have those things, and authentically, convincingly. So what's really the pitch? What can Agile do for a startup? And the more I kind of thought about this and reflected upon it, the more I realized I had to kind of shift and begin to think about, like, what are Agile techniques really, and what is process? And in thinking about it in a more abstract way, I started to look at Agile practices as really sets of rules, as really codes of behavior. And what I realized was that one of the big hurdles of the Agile transformation that I was engaged in is that what I had to sell, quote unquote, to my teammates, what I had to convince them of, influence them on, was the value of discipline. So this honestly was kind of an oh shit moment for me, because I was like, oh shit, I have to sell the value of discipline to a bunch of rebels, a bunch of mavericks, myself included. I kind of dislike rules and routine. I would say the opposite of OCD. I kind of thrive in chaos. But the more I looked at the challenges my team faced, the more it seemed that discipline would really improve our execution. Now, by discipline, I want to be clear that I don't mean dogma. I don't mean that I wanted us to follow exactly what the book says, whatever book. I don't think everybody should just obey strict Scrum guidelines or any really off-the-shelf recommendations of your Agile flavor or author of choice. Now, there's no need to reinvent the wheel, so I think it's important to study and leverage the good work others have done in this field. But I believe that unlocking high performance is also highly personal and situational, and there's a piece of it that's kind of a unique puzzle that each team will kind of have to figure out for themselves. So let's look at the purpose of process. Why not just keep winging it? Winging it has worked. Winging it has got you to where you are at that point in your startup's journey. Do you really need discipline? You may think those are strange questions, but I asked them very sincerely on this journey. And I believe that there are situations in which, keep winging it for now might be the right call. But at Tagged, we had challenges that really did call for a more structured attack. As we grew, we started to see more information silos. Technical debt was something that grew in pace with the size of the organization, if not more so. And as we continued to behave, at least at a top level, in an agile way, in terms of pivoting frequently, we had not learned how to flow value. So in those pivots, you'd have kind of abandoned work, things that didn't ship, which can impact morale. And obviously, if you didn't ship it, it didn't bring value to users. Quality concerns were also issues that seemed like we needed a more structured approach to solve. So some rules and discipline could help us address those issues. So I started looking for what's the most compelling way to present the value of discipline. And the most successful approach I found for convincing others, and honestly for convincing myself, came from kind of a surprising place. It came from outside of the world of Agile and from some of the recent research on habits. So kind of very simplified, for individuals, the creation of habits preserves mental energy. It's like a form of automation, kind of a mental if this, then that. The brain treats a habit as a single unit of behavior, which is significant because of the phenomenon of decision fatigue. Ad hoc decisions, or if you're kind of evaluating and having to weigh choices and analyzing, whether that choice is trivial or significant, will sap the same supply. So you really want to minimize the number of active, evaluative decisions you make so that you can have that reserved for kind of the important decisions and not the trivial ones. And habits kind of move, like offload that, don't draw from that same resource. So if personal habits offload some of that decision work for individuals, perhaps process can do the same thing at an organizational level. And I want you to encourage you to think about it in that way. I've found it useful to really approach process as habit design. And habits that you are building for the explicit purpose of freeing up mental energy. And this is what kind of brings it back in line with those startup values. Because the idea is that we're not doing process for process sake, or we're not doing it to, everyone's concerned about being corporate at a startup. So we're not becoming corporate. We're just trying to build habits so that we can reserve our mental energy to do our core creative work, like to pour it into the innovation that we're all passionate about. At startups in particular, there's really almost a greater fear of process than there is of chaos. People whereas at a large organization, the biggest fear will often be a fear of recklessness. At a startup, the biggest fear is a fear of overhead. Wouldn't this be adding overhead? And you'll hear there's a common complaint that disciplined agile practices will suck up too much time. And to counter that, I think it's good to ask people to look at how winging it is really, if discipline would suck up time, winging it is sucking up your mental energy. So let's automate those behaviors so you can apply your creativity where it matters most. So the ideas I've presented so far have focused mostly on that influencing piece of agile transformations. To summarize quickly, I've found it useful in startup contexts to anticipate your rebels and skeptics, to look at that certain degree of natural agility that exists and examine how better discipline might improve execution. And I want to encourage you to look to habit research for some compelling arguments for the value of discipline. So now I'd like to transition to some implementation details. Get a quick sip of water. So the first of which is rather obvious, but kind of seems to get lost sometimes, is to keep your eyes on the prize. As you choose techniques to bring into your organization, don't forget the big picture. You must be aligned with company strategy. You have to play the long game. The next bit, this is really kind of part influencing and part implementation. So you'd like to use Scrum. Deconstruct it as a code of behavior. Break it down into a series of rules and then examine those rules. Because you'll need to understand and be able to articulate the why of each rule. Why should it be followed? And really kind of like 5 whys deep, because those skeptics will drill you. You'll also need to deeply understand the people on your team and their individual reactions to rules in general, because that's how they're going to kind of react to process. So some tend to follow along, no problem. Some tend to question, and we'll need to understand the why of each rule. And some tend to resist. And don't discount any of them. Don't discount or repress your rebels. Dissent provides an important check and balance, and it's important to really listen. Your skeptics or questioners in particular are very important. Don't ignore them. I've come to feel a deep sense of gratitude towards some of the people who gave me the hardest time in this journey. The holdouts that remained unconvinced, that asked hard questions, and that forced me to explain things in depth were really absolutely critical to helping us make better choices as a team. And your questioners and skeptics can really become your best systems thinkers. And the trick is to kind of get them to use that whole systems lens when they are asking their why questions, to get them to zoom out. So I want to share a few more failure modes that I've seen. These are mistakes that I've made personally, so that I can now come warn you about them. I've also seen them, seen them elsewhere or heard of them from others at conferences and meetups. So I think that they're not too uncommon. So the first is beware the pitfall of optimizing too locally. the goal, the grand prize, is not to have a single awesome Scrum team. One high-performing team is not really success. I mean, awesome, but that's not the big goal. And it can, if you zoom too far in on that, it can, in fact, have negative system effects. As you adopt new behaviors and establish processes, make sure your measures are not too zoomed in like that, focused in too tight, because you could be missing important information in your periphery. And sometimes a change of behavior in one part of the system will actually, you'll pay the price for it. It will create costs in another part of the system. Like that team could kind of be offloading their costs. And you don't want to miss that. And it's surprisingly easy to do so because you'll get excited about the engagement and success you see kind of zoomed in at a team level. You obviously also don't want to optimize for ease of adoption or convenience. You want to keep those big picture things in mind. The second is related. These two kind of have a Goldilocks dynamic or a polarity to be managed. You have to kind of navigate in between these things, is excessive global optimization, which is really, this tends to show up as top-down efforts to standardize on tools or to produce really polished status reports for senior leadership. And the issue there is you should beware of a disconnect, speaking at time, that can emerge if you impose a too tidy structure on what is really a complex reality. You can unintentionally induce fragility that way because essentially what you've created is this layer of fiction. And there can be, you do need to blur out some details so that it's legible to your senior team. But if you forget that you've blurred out those details and think that your simplified, legible version is actually what's happening, then it can lead to poor strategic decisions, and you may think you've added order on chaos, but the mess is just being blurred out. Another form of kind of related to that excessive global optimization is and I see this a lot, and it's a premature focus on tools. If you take one thing away from this talk, try and take this. Get good at technique before you worry too much about tools. Early in a transformation, don't get into tools debates and try and defer those decisions. In fact, if you can, I really recommend just paper prototyping your workflow visualizations early on. Just make paper boards with Post-its on walls and work it out in that rough draft format. Really kind of this search for the perfect tool. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of those clips of exaggerated incompetence in late night infomercials. You know, when you see somebody like they injure themselves with tweezers or they're like tangled in the garden hose or something. And you're looking at them and you're like, you don't need the fancy gadget, you just need better technique. You just need to like learn how to wrap up a hose or something. So it's kind of the same thing here, that people get so obsessed with the tool that they don't realize that what they're really missing is technique. And you'll want to use software tools eventually, just don't rush in. Like, great tools will help you take huge leap forwards when the timing's right at later points. Like once you're ready for robust reporting, which would be totally painstaking on paper, you'll definitely want to automate some of that data collection. So tools are essential to a high-performing Agile team, but just don't rush into selecting them and getting everything in the tool. So lastly, I want to leave you with an exercise. This could be done on your own as you sit here or during the break, or more powerfully, I think it should be done with your teams. I find this especially useful for teams that are doing some kind of homegrown process, or piecemeal Agile, or so-called Scrum butt, all these exceptions of things they've taken out of Scrum. So ask yourselves, what are the rules that you're following? And I didn't put it on the slide here, but I would also add, what rules are you not following? Kind of list those out and try to be clear about them. And how disciplined are you being with those rules? For example, maybe we're all attending stand-ups and holding planning meetings, but we aren't doing retrospectives, and we've never discussed definition of done. Look at those lists, and then talk through the intentions behind those rules or practices. And when they work well for teams, because there's considerable industry evidence that they do, how does that work? What does that look like? What's the mechanism by which those rules are producing good results for others? Do you need those benefits? Do you have them in some other way? Is there a gap? What would it look like if your team was more disciplined about that particular rule? Basically, kind of if you turned that knob. And most of all, to be just very thoughtful about how you modify these processes, looking across the system and thinking long term. And then lastly, to kind of make a pact with your teammates to with a lot of intentionality, be more disciplined about the rules that you are choosing to follow, with the explicit purpose of habit building, so that you can channel that creativity that you have, the inventiveness that you have, into the innovations that you're all passionate about. I also want to give some quick reading recs. Journalist Charles Duhigg wrote a book called The Power of Habit. That's a great layman's overview of the neuroscience research on habits. Blogger Gretchen Rubin has been doing some really interesting recent work on habits. And she's taught habits and personality types, which she calls tendencies, two of which kind of map to the rebels and skeptics that I've talked about here. She calls them rebels and questioners. And Venkat Rao, which is one of my favorite writers and thinkers, blogging on Ribbon Farm, has a great post about the idea of legibility, which is an especially crucial read if you think your team is susceptible to that failure mode of excessive global optimization. If you zoom out too much and just, like, you see a complex local reality, decide it's too complicated, and try and impose an overly simplistic structure on it, and then you've actually made it more fragile. I think that's it. I'm not sure if, oh, it's at 0, so it doesn't look like we have time for questions. I want to say a quick thank you to all of you for attending my talk. I will answer questions on Confluence or on Twitter, or just in the hallways here. Feel free to stop me. And lastly, thank you to Vivian and Allison and all of the Atlassian team for putting together such a great conference. I've learned a lot as both a speaker and an attendee, so thanks.
Thanks, Adele. All right, thanks everyone.